A thug snatched the royal guard's rifle and mocked him in front of everyone, acting like it was all a joke. But the guard's next move wasn't what anyone expected, and what happened next left them all in shock. Now, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. "Look at him standing there like some bloody waxwork," Darren Marsh's voice cut through the pleasant afternoon air surrounding Buckingham Palace. "Bet if I poked him with a stick he'd fall right over." The crowd of tourists shifted uncomfortably, creating space around the tattooed man who'd been growing louder. Darren stood out like a thundercloud, muscled arms covered in prison ink, a jagged scar running from his eyebrow to his temple, and combat boots that had seen actual fights rather than parades. "You getting paid enough to stand there like a muppet?" Darren called out, moving closer to Sergeant James Wilson, whose scarlet tunic and bearskin cap remained perfectly positioned. "Must be the easiest job in London, innit? Playing dress-up while real men do real work." A mother hurriedly pulled her children away. Other tourists continued snapping photos, but with less enthusiasm, their holiday atmosphere punctured by Darren's aggressive presence. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy," Darren persisted, his London accent thickening with each taunt. "Can you even hear me in there, or is that big furry hat blocking your ears?" Sergeant Wilson remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, hands gripping his ceremonial rifle in the exact position outlined in centuries of Queen's Guard protocol. Nothing suggested he was even aware of Darren's existence, though behind the disciplined exterior every sense was heightened, a combat veteran's natural response to potential threats. "Standing here like a bloody statue while people take pictures. How's that defending anything?" Darren continued, circling closer. The smell of cigarettes and cheap beer preceded him. The crowd thinned directly around them, but grew denser a few yards away, the universal fascination with conflict, drawing them in despite better judgment. Phones were raised higher, now recording rather than merely photographing. Darren planted himself directly in front of Wilson, his substantial frame deliberately blocking tourists' photo opportunities. "What's the matter, soldier? Cat got your tongue?" His voice dropped an octave. "Or are you just another government puppet who can't think for himself?" Wilson's eyes remained fixed, his posture perfect, his discipline unwavering. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that true strength often looked like stillness, a lesson Darren was about to learn the hard way. "Ladies and gentlemen," Darren spun around, addressing the crowd, "what we have here is Britain's finest defence strategy. Men in fancy dress, standing perfectly still. Feel safe, do you? Knowing your taxes pay for museum pieces with guns?" A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most tourists shifted awkwardly. "In a country with actual problems, housing crisis, NHS in shambles, they're funding this pantomime." He gestured toward the guard's uniform. "Nice coat, mate. Does it come with a spine, or is that sold separately?" Darren tapped his own forearm, where a faded tattoo of barbed wire wrapped around crude letters spelling respect. "See this? Got this in Pentonville. 4 years for something I actually did, not pretending." His voice grew louder. "Those prison guards! They'd at least fight back when pushed. What do you do except stand there looking pretty?" Wilson remained motionless, though something in his eyes had changed. Not a break in discipline, but a sharpening of focus that would have been recognizable to anyone who'd served in combat. The ceremonial rifle in his white-gloved hands remained perfectly positioned, its gleaming surface reflecting Darren's increasingly agitated movements. "Anyone want to place a bet?" Darren called out, pulling a £20 note from his pocket and waving it above his head. 20 quid says I can make Buckingham Barbie here crack before the hour's up." When no one stepped forward, his smile hardened. "Come on, no takers. What about you?" He pointed to a young man in a university sweatshirt. "Scared to make easy money?" The student lowered his gaze, stepping behind his girlfriend. Darren snorted. "Figured as much. No one's got any bollocks anymore, just like these government-funded mannequins." He turned back to Wilson, studying the guard's immaculate uniform with exaggerated scrutiny. "They polish you up nice and pretty, don't they? Make you look all impressive for the tourists." He leaned in closer. "But we both know the truth. You're just playing at being soldiers while real men do the fighting." Darren pulled up his sleeve further to reveal more prison tattoos, crude symbols of his time in juvenile detention centres, and later, adult prisons. "I've got more battle scars from one night in the scrubs than you probably got in your entire career. At least the guards there would stand their ground." The tension in the air had become palpable, heavy like the humidity before a thunderstorm. Several parents had already removed children from the immediate vicinity, while others watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. "What's under all that fancy dress, I wonder?" Darren circled Wilson like a shark, his voice dropping to a dangerous murmur. "A real soldier? I doubt it. More like a wind-up toy the government trots out to distract the masses." He tapped his temple. "Smart, though, innit? Keep everyone looking at the pretty red coats while the real world burns." He stepped back, addressing the crowd again with arms spread wide. "This is what Britain's come to. We used to be an empire where the sun never set. Now we're reduced to tourist attractions." He gave a harsh laugh. "Our great military tradition is now blokes who can stand still longest. Brilliant strategy for the next world war, that." Darren produced a flask from his jacket pocket, taking a long swallow before gesturing with it toward Wilson. "Cheers, mate, to you and all the other ceremonial relics. May you never have to actually defend anything." The afternoon sun beat down on the palace grounds as Darren began a slow, deliberate circle around Sergeant Wilson. His movements held the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to establishing physical dominance. Each step was measured, testing, probing for a reaction. "You know what I reckon?" Darren said, voice pitched just loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I reckon under all that pomp there's nothing." He moved behind Wilson, disappearing from the guard's direct line of sight. Just an empty uniform propped up to fool the tourists. Wilson remained facing forward, his training prohibiting him from tracking Darren's movements. Years of battlefield awareness, however, allowed him to sense exactly where the man was, currently directly behind him, close enough that Wilson could feel the displacement of air. "Maybe there's a remote control inside," Darren continued, reappearing on Wilson's other side. "A little switch they flip to make you march." He mimicked robotic movements, drawing nervous laughter from a few onlookers. Darren stepped directly in front of Wilson again, studying the bearskin cap with exaggerated interest. His hand rose slowly, fingers extending toward the iconic headpiece. The crowd collectively held its breath as his hand hovered mere inches from the fur, a clear violation of the well-known rules against touching the Queen's Guard. At the last second, Darren pulled back with a wink to the audience. "Almost got him that time, didn't I?" He grinned, pulling out his phone. "Let's get a souvenir." Darren positioned himself beside Wilson, holding his phone at arm's length for a selfie. Rather than simply taking the photo, he contorted his face into grotesque expressions, his middle finger raised beside Wilson's stoic profile. "Smile for Instagram, soldier boy," he taunted, the camera clicking repeatedly. Caption: "Making friends with Britain's most expensive statue." Returning the phone to his pocket, Darren cupped his hand to his ear in a theatrical gesture. "What's that? Central Command calling?" He pretended to receive an earpiece message, nodding seriously. "Yes, sir. Standing perfectly still, sir. Accomplishing absolutely nothing, sir. Mission successful." Several tourists had begun to drift away, the spectacle crossing from awkward entertainment into uncomfortable harassment. Others remained, however, their expressions a mixture of disapproval and morbid curiosity about how far this would go. "Let me show you how it's done," Darren announced, positioning himself beside Wilson. He adopted an exaggerated version of the guard's stance, back painfully straight, chest thrust forward, chin tucked. He held the pose for a few seconds before staggering dramatically, Bloody hell, that's harder than it looks. Maybe there is a skill to professional mannequin work after all. Growing bolder with each unchallenged provocation, Darren moved closer, his shoulder now nearly touching Wilson's. "Can you even see in there, mate?" he asked, waving a hand directly in front of Wilson's unblinking eyes. "Hello? Earth to toy soldier? Anyone home?" With each passing minute, Darren's invasions of personal space grew more flagrant. He examined the brass buttons on Wilson's tunic, leaning in until his breath fogged their polished surface. "Nice and shiny," he commented. "Do they make you polish these yourself, or is there a special button polishing department at Buckingham?" His fingers reached out, flicking one of the metal buttons lightly. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere, like a small bell announcing that another boundary had been crossed. "Bit warm today for all this get-up, innit?" Darren continued, tugging lightly at the sleeve of Wilson's scarlet tunic. "Must be roasting under there, or do they keep you refrigerated to preserve the waxwork?" A young woman in the crowd finally spoke up. "That's enough, don't you think?" Her voice carried a tremor of both fear and indignation. Darren's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. "Mind your own, love. The soldier and I are having a conversation." He turned back to Wilson with renewed focus, as if the interruption had reminded him of his original purpose. "Well, I'm having a conversation. He's doing his best impression of a red-coated plank." With deliberate slowness, Darren raised a finger and pressed it against the guard's uniform over his chest insignia. "What's this, then? Some fancy badge they give you for standing still the longest?" His finger remained there, the physical contact a clear violation, a dare, a challenge. Wilson's eyes remained forward, his breathing unchanged, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw now, invisible to everyone except those trained to notice the microscopic tells of a disciplined soldier reaching his limit. "What happens if I just—" Darren's gaze fixed on the ceremonial rifle in Sergeant Wilson's white-gloved hands. Something calculating flashed in his eyes, a decision being made, a line about to be crossed. The crowd sensed it too, their collective breath held as Darren's body language changed from mere provocation to predatory intent. "That's not even a real gun, is it?" Darren's voice had dropped to a whisper, meant only for Wilson's ears. "Just a prop for the tourists." His fingers flexed at his sides, unconsciously rehearsing the movement to come. "Bet they don't even trust you with live ammunition." Wilson's gaze remained fixed forward, but decades of military training had heightened his peripheral awareness. The slight shift in Darren's weight, the focused attention on the rifle, the subtle tensing of shoulder muscles, all registered as pre-attack indicators that combat veterans recognize instinctively. "Let's find out, shall we?" Darren said, his voice suddenly sharp with decision. What happened next occurred so quickly that many tourists would later disagree about the sequence of events. Darren lunged forward, his movements surprisingly swift for his bulky frame, his hands adorned with crude prison tattoos across the knuckles, spelling hate and fear, shot out with practiced precision. Not the clumsy grab of a drunk provocateur, but the calculated movement of someone who had disarmed others before. His fingers wrapped around the polished wood of the rifle's stock, the sudden contact violating centuries of tradition in an instant. For a microsecond, something passed between the two men. Wilson's eyes flickered directly to Darren's for the first time, a silent warning delivered and deliberately ignored. With a sharp yank, Darren wrenched the ceremonial weapon from Wilson's grasp. The force of the motion carried him backward several steps, the rifle now clutched triumphantly in his hands. The crowd gasped in unified shock, the sound rolling across the palace grounds like a wave breaking against stones. Time seemed to crystallize into perfect stillness. Wilson stood with empty hands, his posture unchanged despite the violation. Darren stood holding the rifle, momentary surprise on his face at his own success. Tourists froze mid-motion, cameras and phones suspended in air. Even the pigeons on the nearby railings seemed to pause their ceaseless movement. Then, into that perfect silence, Darren's harsh laugh shattered the moment. "Would you look at that?" he crowed, holding the rifle aloft like a trophy. "Britain's finest security, ladies and gentlemen, can't even hold on to his own weapon." The ceremonial rifle, a precision-made L85A2, modified for guard duty, but identical in form to those used in actual combat, gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Darren turned it over in his hands. Each guard's rifle was meticulously maintained, its brass fittings polished to mirror finish, its wooden stock rubbed to a warm glow by countless hours of drill practice. "Nice craftsmanship," Darren commented, running his fingers along the barrel with mock appreciation. "Bit lighter than I expected, though. Not much use in a real fight, is it?" He raised it to his shoulder, pretending to take aim at the palace windows. Several tourists gasped, instinctively ducking despite knowing the weapon wasn't loaded. A young child began crying somewhere in the crowd, the sound piercingly clear in the tense atmosphere. Parents pulled their children back further, creating a widening circle around the unfolding scene. Security cameras mounted discreetly on the palace walls had already swiveled toward the disturbance, their silent electronic eyes recording everything. "Come on then," Darren challenged, turning back to Wilson. "What are you going to do about it? Stand there looking pretty?" He cradled the rifle in his arms like an infant, patting it mockingly. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of your toy." He began a theatrical inspection of the weapon, squinting down its length. "This thing ever seen action, or just parades?" His fingers traced the regimental insignia engraved on the stock. The famous Queen's Guard, all dress and no fight. Something shifted in the air as Darren's finger curled around the trigger guard. Not a threat exactly, but a profound disrespect for what the weapon represented. Each rifle carried by the Queen's Guard was more than ceremonial. It was a symbol of service, of sacrifice, of brothers lost in distant conflicts. Wilson had carried a nearly identical rifle through dust-choked compounds in Helmand Province, had used it to protect civilians and comrades alike. "Anyone want a photo?" Darren called out, striking a pose with the rifle. "Once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hold a piece of British pageantry." His grin was wide, but his eyes darted nervously toward the palace gates, a flicker of realization perhaps dawning that he'd crossed from nuisance into serious offence. Instead of backing down, Darren doubled down. He began an exaggerated march, mimicking the Queen's Guard's famous patrol, the rifle held awkwardly across his chest. "Look at me. I'm a fancy guard. Don't mind me, just protecting Britain with my shiny buttons." It was in mid-stride that Darren caught Wilson's eyes again. The guard's gaze had changed, still disciplined, still controlled, but now focused with lethal intention directly on Darren's face. It was the look of a predator who had allowed the prey enough rope to hang itself, who had measured the exact distance for a strike, who had calculated precisely how much force would be necessary. In that moment, Darren's smile faltered. Something in Wilson's eyes told him he had miscalculated badly. This wasn't a mannequin, a ceremonial figure, or a toy soldier. This was a combat veteran who had now been relieved of his duty to stand motionless. The realization came a moment too late. Sergeant James Wilson moved with such explosive precision that many tourists would later swear the guard had teleported. 20 years of military discipline, thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training, and 3 combat tours crystallized into a single fluid motion that erased the space between him and Darren in less than a second. His ceremonial stance dissolved into pure military efficiency. One moment he stood with perfect parade ground posture. The next, he was a battlefield operator, neutralizing a threat. There was nothing ceremonial about the hand that clamped onto Darren's wrist with crushing force, nothing theatrical about the leg that swept Darren's feet from under him. Darren found himself suddenly airborne, the world spinning around him before his back slammed against the courtyard stones. The rifle was gone from his hands before he registered the loss, reclaimed by Wilson, with the same practiced motion that had disarmed countless insurgents in night operations far from London's tourist spots. As Darren gasped for the breath knocked from his lungs, Wilson stood over him, the rifle now properly secured in his grip. His posture had transformed, no longer the static guard, but now the active soldier, his body angled to maintain both control of the situation and maximum tactical advantage. That, Wilson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command rather than the bluster of intimidation, was a serious mistake. The crowd had retreated further, forming a wide circle around the scene. In the distance, palace security could be seen moving rapidly toward them, but Wilson continued, his words measured and precise. "This rifle," he indicated the weapon now securely in his possession, "is not a prop. It is not a toy. It represents the service and sacrifice of every man and woman who has stood where I stand." His voice remained level, but carried to every corner of the suddenly silent courtyard. "When you took it, you didn't just break protocol, you disrespected every soldier who has carried it in defense of this nation." Darren attempted to rise, but Wilson's boot pressed lightly against his chest, not crushing, just authoritative. "Stay down until security arrives. You've created enough of a scene." "You can't," Darren began, his earlier bravado evaporating. "I can," Wilson interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "Under the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act, interfering with a Queen's Guard in the execution of his duties is an offence. Taking his weapon elevates that considerably." Wilson's eyes scanned the crowd briefly before returning to Darren. "Before I resumed my post, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards. The men you see standing ceremonial duty are active duty combat soldiers who rotate between operational deployments and ceremonial duties." He adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Last year, I was leading patrols through compounds in Helmand. 6 months before that, I was evacuating civilians during a hostage situation. This uniform isn't costume. It's a continuation of service." Darren's face had paled considerably. "I didn't know." "That was apparent," Wilson cut him off. "But ignorance doesn't excuse your behaviour." The security team was drawing closer, but Wilson continued. "This rifle you so casually grabbed has a twin that I carried through firefights. Some of the men who maintained weapons like these never came home." A hush had fallen over the courtyard. Even tourists who had been avoiding the confrontation had turned to listen, Wilson's quiet authority drawing their attention more effectively than Darren's loud provocations ever had. "Each button you mocked connects directly to battlefield traditions that have kept soldiers alive for generations. The discipline you found so amusing? It's the same discipline that prevents chaos in combat zones." Wilson's eyes held Darren's with unwavering intensity. "When you stand at post for 8 hours, maintaining perfect posture regardless of weather, discomfort or provocations like yours, you build the mental resilience needed to hold position under enemy fire for days if necessary." The security team had arrived at the edge of the clearing but paused, seemingly reluctant to interrupt. "The perfect creases in this uniform, the polished brass, the precise movements, all of it builds the attention to detail that keeps soldiers alive in combat, where the smallest oversight can be fatal." Wilson shifted slightly, his posture relaxing fractionally as security moved in. "You thought you were mocking a costume, but you were actually revealing your own ignorance about what real strength looks like. It's not about intimidation or aggression. It's about discipline, self-control, and service to something greater than yourself." As 2 security officers reached Darren, Wilson stepped back, allowing them to take control of the situation. One of them, noting the rifle in Wilson's hands, gave a respectful nod before turning his attention to Darren. Wilson addressed Darren one final time before returning to his post. The next time you see a guard standing motionless, remember this: we don't stand still because we can't move. We stand still because we have the discipline not to. With that, Wilson executed a perfect turn and marched back to his position with parade ground precision. Within moments, he had resumed the ceremonial stance, eyes forward, posture perfect, ceremonial rifle exactly positioned, as if the entire incident had never occurred. But something had changed. The tourists viewing him now did so with new eyes, seeing beyond the iconic uniform to the soldier within. The respect in their gazes was no longer just for tradition, but for the man upholding it. Security personnel flanked Darren as he was helped to his feet, their firm grips on his arms making it clear this wasn't optional assistance. The bravado that had animated his features earlier had drained away, replaced by the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated the situation. "This is ridiculous," Darren attempted, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "It was just a bit of fun." The lead security officer, a former Royal Military Police officer named Harrington, regarded Darren with professional detachment. Interfering with a Queen's Guard, unauthorized handling of a ceremonial weapon, causing a public disturbance at a protected royal site. These aren't minor offences, sir. Protected site? Darren's face paled further. Under the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act, you've potentially committed several offences that carry significant penalties. The Metropolitan Police have been notified and are en route. A constable was already waiting at the security office. "We'll need your full name and address," she stated, her tone making it clear this was the beginning of a formal process. "This is insane," Darren protested, though with less vigour. "All I did was take the rifle for a second. It's not like it was loaded." Handling any weapon belonging to His Majesty's forces without authorization is a serious offence, regardless of whether it's loaded. The ceremonial rifles are classified as military equipment under the Protection of the Armed Forces Act. Darren slumped against the wall. How was I supposed to know all that? By respecting clearly established boundaries and observing basic decorum, Harrington replied evenly. Outside the window, the palace grounds had returned to normal. Tourists once again moved in orderly groups. Sergeant Wilson remained at his post, his bearing perfect, his discipline unshaken by the earlier confrontation. Several tourists had paused near his position, studying him with new appreciation. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, asking questions that were answered in a respectful tone, quite different from the usual tourist banter. "Will I have to go to court?" Darren asked, his earlier swagger now completely absent. "That depends on several factors, including any prior offences. At minimum, you'll receive a summons and likely a substantial fine. The Crown Prosecution Service takes offences at royal sites particularly seriously." Darren ran a hand over his face, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "I didn't think—" "That much was evident," Harrington interjected calmly. "Most people don't realise that the Queen's Guard aren't ceremonial figures. They're active duty combat soldiers performing a specific duty rotation. The rifle you took from Sergeant Wilson has likely seen actual combat service." A flash of genuine shame crossed Darren's face for the first time. "He mentioned something about Afghanistan." "3 tours," Harrington confirmed. "Sergeant Wilson is a decorated combat veteran who's saved lives in active conflict zones. The discipline you mocked is the same discipline that keeps soldiers effective under fire." Through the window they could see Wilson standing perfectly still at his post, exactly as regulations required. Nothing in his bearing suggested he had been involved in a confrontation just minutes earlier. "Will he get in trouble?" Darren asked unexpectedly. "For, taking me down like that?" Harrington's expression remained neutral. Sergeant Wilson acted within protocol for securing a weapon that had been improperly removed from his possession. His commanding officer has already been briefed and found no fault with his actions. The Metropolitan Police transport vehicle arrived outside, its distinctive markings drawing curious glances from passing tourists. As Darren was escorted out to be formally processed at the station, his last view of the palace grounds showed Sergeant Wilson performing the precise, measured movements of the guard change. relieved of his post by another soldier who mirrored his perfect discipline. In that moment, perhaps for the first time, Darren understood what real strength looked like. Not the loud intimidation he had practiced, but the quiet discipline that had allowed Wilson to maintain his composure until duty required action, and then to return to that composure immediately afterward. The lesson had been expensive, but it was one Darren wouldn't soon forget. Thank you for watching another powerful story about the Royal Guards and the respect they deserve. These men and women are not just ceremonial figures. They're highly trained soldiers with real combat experience who uphold centuries of tradition while maintaining modern military excellence. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that showcase the dignity and discipline behind the iconic uniforms. Don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our new uploads. What would you have done if you witnessed someone disrespecting a royal guard this way? Have you ever seen someone completely misjudge a situation and face unexpected consequences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen now. And remember, sometimes the quietest strength is the most powerful of all.